Right, our next speaker is Stuart Kaufman, who's going to talk about the Nobel Peace Prize. Stuart's professor in the Political Science and International Relations Department. That's okay, you can come. He earned his PhD in 1991 at the University of Michigan, and after another position, joined the University of Delaware in 2004. He specializes in studies of ethnic conflict, international security affairs, and international relations theory. Among other appointments, Dr. Kaufman spent 1999 working as director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs on the U.S. National Security Council staff. He was named the winner of the 2003 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. That's a very good award to get. And as I say, he's going to be telling us tonight about this year's Nobel Peace Prize.
Thanks, Doug. Is this on? You hearing me? Good, okay. So the part of my expertise that I guess is relevant is, as the national security guy, one of the things that I'm supposed to deal with is disarmament and arms control. And so this year's winner is an arms control and disarmament organization. Because it's an organization, kind of faceless, it's a little hard to find the right images. These slides are a little boring, sorry. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you kind of the short version of who they are and why they won, and then the somewhat longer version. Here's the short version. That's their cute little logo. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is in charge of monitoring the destruction of all chemical weapons worldwide. As a result of the Chemical Weapons Convention that's been signed by just about every country, all chemical weapons in the world are supposed to be destroyed over a certain period of time. And so their job is to monitor that and to make sure that it happens. And they've been doing that for 20 years. And so why they're the winner, the short version is, first of all, the Nobel Committee has a long-standing interest in promoting disarmament. Disarmament was one of the issues that was in Alfred Nobel's will. So this is something they care about. But also it's topical. It's in the news now because the OPCW is overseeing the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons as a result of that deal that was brokered by Russia to head off the threatened American bombing of Syria. So it's this combination of things that seems to have gotten the committee's attention. So to back up and give you a little bit more detail, the organization was created, as I mentioned, as a result of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which went into effect in 1993. So they've been around now for 20 years. As I said, basically every country in the world is a member. 190 states have signed and ratified the treaty. There are only 7 that have not. The 2 of the relevant ones are Syria and North Korea, but obviously Syria is being brought into the fold. So the agreement's very simple. Everybody agrees to destroy all chemical weapons and not to make any more. There was supposed to be, I think it was originally a 15-year time frame in which all chemical weapons were supposed to be destroyed by all signatories. Didn't quite work out that way, especially the Americans and the Russians just had so much of this stuff. They're still working on it. The photo is of the Director General of the organization, Ahmet Uzumcu of Turkey. To the extent they have a face, he would be it. All right, so what do? They've got what's called a technical secretariat. The structure of it is not unlike the way the UN works. You've got a council of representatives of nations that are supposedly in charge of making the decisions. But of course, the big decisions are already made. They're made in the treaty. So most of the work of the organization here is done by the bureaucratic staff of the organization, organized into the secretariat. They're based in The Hague, Netherlands. And their job is to carry out these inspections to check up on both of those key provisions of the treaty. Number 1, to watch the destruction of existing chemical weapons stocks. And number 2, to check industrial facilities to make sure that they're making legitimate chemicals and not new chemical weapons. So according to their website, they've carried out about 6,000 of these inspections over the course of the last 20 years. So they're a pretty busy group. They've got a budget of, it's listed as 75 million euros a year, so that translates into $100 million. About 500 employees. I presume a lot of them are chemical engineers and chemists. And of course, a lot of other folks as well. One piece of background is that the OPCW is not unique. It's actually part of a family of organizations, all of which are in charge of carrying out different arms control tasks. The best known of those is the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. They're the folks who do the inspections in accordance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. For example, at the moment, the US is worried about whether the Iranians are building a bomb or not. So the IAEA are the folks who go in and inspect the nuclear power plants and other nuclear-related facilities in Iran to verify that, that nothing that's specifically bomb-related is happening. So that's one example. Another one, very little known, I didn't know about it myself until I just sort of happened upon a briefing that was being given by its leaders, is the CTBTO. That's Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. Most of you have heard of the Comprehensive Test Ban. This is a really impressive organization. They have, this is for the geologists in the room, if there are any, they've got monitoring stations all over the world that are capable of detecting any seismic activity pretty much anywhere in the world and discerning whether that seismic activity is an underground nuclear test or an earthquake. So the OPCW, the honoree this year, is part of this family of organizations, all of them more or less loosely associated with the UN, whose job is to oversee and verify to make sure that these arms control and disarmament treaties are actually being carried out. And in fact, they've accomplished quite a bit. So over the course of the 20 years that they've been in operation, they've verified the destruction of 51,000 tons of chemical weapons, which is about 72% of the total world stocks as of when the treaty was signed in '93. Now, as it turns out, 98% of those stocks were in the US and Russia. The Russians have destroyed a little bit more than the US has. They also have more left to destroy than the US has. But nevertheless, destroying 72% of the chemical weapons in the world, that's an accomplishment. And so just for completeness, I can mention that there are 5 other countries that are signatories to the treaty that have chemical weapons stocks that are also working on getting rid of them or have already done so. So one other piece of progress is that just recently, the OPCW announced that they have verified the end of the Syrian manufacture of chemical weapons. They checked out all of the facilities where Syria had previously been making chemical weapons and were able to verify, no, that's not what they're doing now. Not too surprising in the middle of a civil war, that wouldn't be their top priority, but it's a step. And so what they're trying to do now is to monitor the existing Syrian stockpiles, figure out where all that stuff is kept, and make sure that it's not going to be used. All of this, of course, in the middle of a fairly nasty civil war. So, the other piece of this is that, what's being awarded here is these folks have some courage, right? First of all, you're dealing with deadly chemical weapons, all right? Specifically designed to kill people, and you've got to watch while it's being destroyed. It's a pretty technically demanding task, and if something goes wrong, it could be very bad for your health. And then just getting there, in case of someplace like Syria, may also be hazardous to your health. So that's part of what's being awarded here. There's some dedication and courage involved in doing this. So a little more detail on kind of the logic behind why they would presumably won. As I said, disarmament is important in Alfred Nobel's will. He was very interested in disarmament. And it's worth kind of keeping in mind that I talked about arms control and disarmament together. But there's a very complicated relationship between the two concepts. During the Cold War, we had arms control, which is kind of like agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union that will limit how many new missiles we build. Right? Disarmament is about getting rid of, ideally, entire categories of weapons. This was in vogue early in the century, and these minor little incidents called World War I and World War II intervened. So they didn't get very far with disarmament. So arms control was the fallback plan during the Cold War. But then towards the end of the Cold War, the pendulum moved back and the idea of disarmament became realistic, starting with the INF treaty that President Reagan signed with the Soviets in 1987. You could start getting rid of entire categories of weapons. First it was medium-range missiles. The Chemical Weapons Convention is part of that. So they are applauding something that they have long believed in. And again, there's a track record here. The IAEA, which I mentioned before, won the Nobel in 2005. So it's the same logic. They're trying to promote disarmament in all these different categories as part of furthering peace. Another example, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines won the Nobel in '97. Right, this is the organization not that is carrying out an arms control agreement, or disarmament agreement, but one that's pushing for one, which has not yet gone into force, largely because the United States has been resisting it. Another piece of this is the Nobel Committee also has this track record of supporting ongoing efforts. If something's happening that they'd like to see continue, they will award the Nobel Prize to try to give a boost, right? And that's part of the logic behind honoring, for example, President Obama right after he was elected, right? Obviously, he had not, after a few months, accomplished everything that he had hoped to achieve in 4 years. They just wanted to give him a little boost in his efforts because they thought he was moving in the right direction. So from that point of view, the Nobel Committee's logic would be the Syria deal likely prevented an escalation of the Civil War. The United States was threatening to bomb. If the United States had bombed, the likelihood is that there would have been even more violence. It wasn't going to end anything. It would have punished the Syrian regime, which was part of the logic, but it certainly wouldn't have led to less violence, certainly not in the short term. So that's also part of what they're trying to encourage. I disagree with Doug a little bit. This is politics, so there's always going to be controversy about who wins the Nobel Peace Prize and why. Those of you who know me know that I'm not particularly given to hero worship of anybody. So there's always going to be an argument, well, maybe they shouldn't have won. What's the argument against? Because it's always controversial. Well, this time, the argument against would be based on the notion that the deal that the United States and the Russians and the Syrians agreed to has the odd effect of turning a war crime into a diplomatic victory. This isn't a particularly clear reproduction of the photo, but those are some of the victims of the chemical weapons attack. They look like they're sleeping. They are dead. That's a morgue. We don't know exactly how many people were killed in that attack, somewhere between 300 and 1,400, depending on which source you look at. One result of the fact that there was this deal to bring in the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is that Syria is not going to be punished for launching this strike. Syria, in fact, manages to look moderate for agreeing to disarm after they've committed the war crime. And they've managed to change the focus of international diplomacy, if not entirely, then at least partly, away from the central issue of the Civil War, which is that they are a brutal regime that the majority of their population wanted to get rid of. That's off the table. And now we're talking about, ooh, aren't the Syrians good because they're getting rid of their chemical weapons while they slaughter their population with conventional weapons? So that's part of the controversy. And so, just a little bit more about the Syrian regime. There's Mr. Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. This diplomatic victory that Syria won internationally has weakened the rebel alliance trying to overthrow them. The alliance is starting to split. So the government's position is being strengthened as a result of this process. So that means, in turn, that likely the Syrian government's lease on life has been extended a bit. And it's worth remembering that the Civil War started in the first place because when the Arab Spring started to move to Damascus and ordinary Syrians were peacefully protesting for political change, Bashar sicked his army on them and started slaughtering peaceful protesters. So the opponents of the regime took up arms instead. So he started the Civil War, quite simply. Bashar's an interesting fellow. I say here, he's sort of like the Michael Corleone of this situation. His father, Hafiz al-Assad, is kind of the classic godfather figure. When Hafez faced an uprising against his regime back in 1982 in the town of Hama, he leveled the town. 20,000 people were killed. He plowed it. And then invited people in to see. Bashar wasn't going to be the successor. The successor was going to be his brother, Basil. But Basil was killed in a car crash. He was the Sonny Corleone, right, the crazy brother who got himself killed young. So they bring in Bashar, who's an ophthalmologist living in London. And his father says, okay, you're going to have to take over the family business. So he is working with his consiglieres and with his security folks who tell him, this is the way your dad operated, this is the way it happens. And he has been doing it. So this is who we're helping, the Michael Corleone of Syria. The other piece of why you could say that it's controversial that the OPCW won is that there were certainly other plausible candidates who also fit in with the kinds of things that the Nobel Peace Prize is all about. One of them most of you have heard of, I'm sure, Malala Yousafzai. This is the young girl who was famously shot by the Taliban, shot in the head on her school bus because she was promoting education for girls. And, so here's somebody who is standing up against war and violence and in favor of peaceful change instead. So if the Nobel Peace Prize stands for anything, it ought to stand for that. All right? So you could make the case, well, it should have been Malala. Another person whose name surfaced, of course, officially it's secret who the nominees are, so you don't know for sure, but if these names circulated, they were probably nominated. Dr. Denis Mukwege has treated thousands of rape victims, including victims of mass rape in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is, by the way, of course, where Albert Schweitzer made his name. So this is kind of the modern update of Albert Schweitzer. So here's another person standing up peacefully against violence and war in the world. So that's the other piece of the argument. There are other people they could have picked. So here's my conclusion. There's no easy answers in questions of war and peace. There never are. So the case for it is the OPCW. That choice is certainly in line with Alfred Nobel's will, with their past practice of recognizing similar kinds of organizations, doing similar kinds of good work. The OPCW has been effective at overseeing the destruction of chemical weapons in other places. Now they're moving on to Syria. So those are all positives. On the other hand, they're implementing an agreement that is helping to save an unsavory regime. So, pros and cons. Questions?
Your questions for Stuart, yeah? Here's one. Let me give you a microphone so people can hear you.
Thank you. How do they destroy a chemical weapon? Do they treat it with another chemical to neutralize it, to make it human-friendly, or do they store it in some place where nobody can use it?
Yeah, good question. And the short answer is it varies a lot depending on the type of weapon. The more sophisticated kinds of chemical weapons are so-called binary weapons, which takes two chemicals that are themselves not lethal and then mixes them at the time of use. So keeping those separate is a much less delicate task than taking an actual artillery shell full of nerve gas and trying to neutralize that. But by and large, the answer is one way or another, they do try to neutralize it or to destroy it without just detonation. Sometimes they'll do, for example, incineration in sight. But all of the options are uncomfortable when you think about it. So which would you like better if you've got a chemical weapons dump in your neighborhood? Do you want to build the incinerator there? Or do you want to load that stuff onto railroad cars and have it carted through the middle of town to an incineration somewhere else? Right? Both of them are a little, whatever your options are, they're unpleasant. So, depending on what precisely the chemical is, they've got a different process that at least hopefully is likely to pose the least risk of harm to anybody.
Here you go. Is part of this group work to stop teaching people how to make these weapons, and how much of them are learning that in the United States?
Yeah, good question. The short answer is no. That's not what they do. Unfortunately, the fact is that it's not terribly hard to find these things out. If ask any chemist on campus, they could probably tell you the basic process of how to make your basic nerve gas. Scientific advance is inherently morally neutral. You can use pretty much any scientific advance to do something good, or you can use the same scientific advance to do something bad. Sometimes you're trying to do good and you do bad. For example, the famous Bhopal disaster in India a few decades ago. Union Carbide plant is making, fertilizer or something, blows up, a giant cloud of toxic gas floats out over the town and kills thousands of people. So there's nothing technically hard about finding ways to kill lots of people. So trying to suppress the knowledge isn't feasible, right? And trying to figure out other ways of using chemistry isn't necessary, because that's all pretty widely known too. So these folks are just specifically focused on this one thing. They're just going to get rid of the weapons that exist and make sure that more are not being made. Putting the genie of the knowledge back in the bottle just isn't feasible.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop there. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.